Welcome to the Denison Forum podcast. I'm Mark Turman, Executive Director at Denison Forum, back for another conversation. We're going to talk about truth over tribe, and I'm here with my co-host, Mark Legg. Good morning, Mark.
Good morning, Mark.
Yeah, we are remarkable, aren't we?
Yes.
Yes. We've passed a law here at our organization. Nobody else can be hired who has a name that sounds like ours.
Yes,
Yeah,
that's right.
There can be no more Marks. And we are joined today by Patrick Miller, who is one of the co-pastors at the Crossing Church in Columbia, Missouri. Patrick, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I love opening a podcast with a good Mark Lark.
Oh, no. You're not one of those kindred spirit people that's going to take us down that road, are you?
Well, I am a dad, so these kinds of jokes come to me naturally.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, just so you know, we have a coworker here that likes to refer to us as the Remarkables. So if you would do that for the rest of the podcast, we'd be grateful.
Mm-hmm.
Don't tempt me.
Yeah.
Yeah. We've already used the remarkable joke once, so I think we can't do it anymore on the podcast.
I don't know. My co-host, he has this running joke that I went to a private school, which I did not do, and he has beat that thing into a bloody pulp of a horse and will not stop. So, I think you keep going with it. If it works, run with it.
Well, I get a sense that you are way more experienced at podcasting than Mark and I are. You have a podcast. Tell us a little bit about the Truth Over Tribe podcast, just as a starting place, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. We started Truth Over Tribe a little over a year ago, and we're both pastors. We're not academics. What we realized, though, at the time was that as pastors, we were being asked different kinds of questions than we were asked 5 or 10 years ago. 5 or 10 years ago, people would ask us questions about baptism. Should you baptize infants or not? They'd ask us questions about predestination or election or God's sovereignty. And I really kind of miss those days when people ask me those kinds of questions because they don't ask them anymore. Now, the kinds of questions they're asking are, what's your view on CRT? What's your view of Donald Trump? How do you respond to the LGBTQ agenda? And I think that in a lot of ways, those are sincere questions. But as we sought to answer them, what we began to discover was that for many people, they didn't want Jesus's answer. They didn't want the Sermon on the Mount. What they really wanted were the scriptural pages of the New York Times or the sermonizing maybe of Tucker Carlson. They wanted us to parrot their favorite media personality. And when we refused to do that, it caused all different kinds of problems in our church. And I kind of saw that as a failure in discipleship, that we had a real paucity of good content that was helping sincere Christians to navigate this political world. And I think we didn't have it because we didn't want to offend people. We didn't want to put obstructions in front of the gospel like political talk. But the net result was that Christians, they didn't cease to be discipled. Instead, they were being discipled largely by media. And so that was really the heart behind the podcast was, can we talk about these political cultural issues in a Jesus-honoring way, so with kindness and gentleness? And can we do it in a way that foregrounds Jesus's kingdom ethics and backgrounds maybe the partisan ethics that people tend to get stuck in? And so that was really the genesis of the podcast. And in a lot of ways, it's also the heart behind our book. We're not very creative, so everything's called Truth Over Tribe. The book Truth Over Tribe is very much so the exact same heart. That's it. Now, I will say this, the book is less about politics. We're not trying to convince someone to become a Republican or a Democrat or anything like that. It's more about how can we help our churches become less tribal? How can we help our churches be places where there is some maybe political diversity, where you can feel welcome, whether you voted on the left or you voted on the right? And we wrote that book in part because that's actually what our church is. Mm-hmm. Missouri is a Republican state. We consistently vote for Republicans. But we live in a college town. So as you can imagine, a lot of our town is actually progressive or on the left. And that meant that our church was always a mix of those two things. People were in small groups together who voted for different presidents. People were worshiping alongside one another who voted for different state senators. And so that's always been at the heart of what our church was. And we thought it was really beautiful because where else can those kinds of people come together in this world? When Jesus structures your reality, you can put those things into the background. They become less important. What becomes more important is what we have in common, which is that he died for our sins and that we will be raised again with him in the resurrection. I mean, isn't that far more profound than we voted for the same person? And so that's really the heart behind both the book and the podcast.
Yeah, well, that's a great way to get started. But let me back up and give the formal introduction to Patrick Miller, just so people can kind of color in the lines a little bit. And then, Patrick, you can add to this any which way you want to. but you told me a little bit ago that you're a native of Missouri. Patrick Miller is pastor and also a cultural commentator who writes about politics, culture, and technology. We might even get into that area eventually. He has contributed articles to Christianity Today, Newsweek, the Gospel Coalition, and other publications. As he just mentioned, Truth Over Tribe is his podcast, along with his co-author and co-pastor Keith Simon, one of Apple's top-rated news commentary podcasts. It features interviews with Christian thinkers, writers, scholars. Patrick received a Master of Divinity from Covenant Theological Seminary and pastors, as he said, a politically diverse church called The Crossing in Columbia. He is married to Emily, and they have, most importantly, 2 children, right? They are the 2 best children on the planet, I'm sure.
Oh, they 100% are. There's nothing wrong with those kids at all.
Which means they're still preschoolers, right?
Yes. Well, first grader and a preschooler. You know, I'm dreading once they become teenagers. I don't know how I'll manage that.
All right. Since he's not here and we can blame him for everything, give us the elevator speech on your co-pastor and co-author, Keith Simon.
Well, Keith co-founded The Crossing with our other co-lead pastor, Dave Cover, and they founded the church really along the same lines that I just laid out. They wanted a church that was going to welcome people to meet Jesus. And that's been at the heart of The Crossing. We're a church that emphasizes process. We're a church that says you don't have to have your whole life together. And you can come here even if you have doubts, even if you're a skeptic. And what we've seen is, this church has led to the conversions of, really thousands of people since it launched 20 years ago. And that's again, really at the heart of what we're saying inside of the book. And what's the heart of our church is we want to make disciples of all the nations. And to do that, you have to have a place that isn't politically syncretized, that doesn't just match up with one political ideology. Because the minute you do that, you're going to turn people away from the gospel.
Exactly.
So do you think when you started this book, when you started writing it, were there things that you came to realize in the process of writing it that you didn't see already pastoring? Did you have some unique insights from the book? And then, I want to kind of start there because I'm sure that there's a lot of pastoral experience that went into this book. I saw it when I read it, but there's also the, unique insight that you get from studying something like this so in depth to actually write it.
Yeah, I feel like I learned so much in the process of writing this book. One of the things that I discovered was that there is a huge amount of writing right now on tribalism, why humans are tribal, how our particular cultural moment has become so tribal. But those books tend to be by academics, and that's where they tend to start. That's where they tend to end. And we realized that there was a real need here for a book that was going to speak to everyday people using everyday illustrations, everyday applications written in a conversational tone. And that was really the heart of writing this. Was we wanted to give people something where they would walk away and say, I have real action steps in my life. They come from the way of Jesus, of how to turn down the temperature on political conversations, on political tribalism in my church, build bridges with people who aren't like me. One of the things I felt like I learned in the midst of this was you write a book that is ostensibly, essentially the anti-tribalism book, Let's Not Be Tribal. But what I learned in the process was that really no one is anti-tribal. We all have tribalistic tendencies. And I actually think that God hardwired this into us for good reasons. If you think about the world before Genesis 3, the tribal desire to belong, to sacrifice for the tribe, to give of yourself for your neighbor. That's a really beautiful, wonderful thing. But in a after Genesis 3 world, that metastasizes into the desire to exclude, to kick people out, to demonize, to attack. And what I discovered was that Jesus, he really established a brand new kind of tribe. And I hesitate to call it a tribe because it's so other than the other kinds of tribes out there, because his tribe is the only tribe where there are no ethnic boundary markers. There's no one who's kept out of his tribe. Everybody is invited to be a part of his tribe. It doesn't matter what your sexuality is. It doesn't matter what your gender is, what your nationality or ethnicity is. Now, no one stays the same once they come into the tribe, but everybody is welcomed into this tribe. And the other thing is that normal tribes, at least in a Genesis 3 world, they want to attack others. They want to win. They want to be the top tribe. But Jesus launches the first tribe in human history that says one of our chief goals is to love other tribes, is to put other tribes first. And so, yes, what I kind of learned in the process was I am a tribalist, but I only get one choice, which is which tribe am I going to join? And if you join the Jesus tribe, you join the only tribe that doesn't exclude, and you join the only tribe that is for others.
And I noticed there's some indications that you put in the book, and I'm sure this came in your research, about that neuroscience actually affirms this kind of innate, built-in, hardwired tribalism, right?
Yeah. And I really kind of had to wrestle with that because, again, if you think tribalism is just a Genesis 3 reality, you kind of have a hard time when you start reading all of this social psychology that's suggesting that it's actually hardwired into us. And that's part of why I laid out a theological vision. In fact, let me expand that a little bit. There's something called oxytocin. It's the love drug. This is what a mother's brain releases when she sees her baby for the first time. It's also what the baby's brain releases whenever the mother is holding the baby. It's what you feel when you're with your love, and it's what you're missing when you feel like the love has gone out. And oxytocin is also what's released when you get military people and they're marching in lockstep together. It releases oxytocin in your brain. When we worship together, it releases oxytocin in your brain. If you go to a rave and everybody's dancing together, it releases oxytocin in your brain. And so the thought of these researchers, a guy named Karsten DeDrew, was if we just put more oxytocin into the water, maybe we can end tribalism. Because when you have more oxytocin, you're more self-sacrificial. I mean, maybe that'll solve the problem. And so what he did was he had a test, and he had a group of men, and he put oxytocin into their noses. So he infused them with oxytocin. There was a control group as well. And he discovered that the group that had the oxytocin was, in fact, more self-sacrificial. They were willing to give for one another. But here was the disturbing part. He also discovered that they were more antagonistic towards outsiders. And so oxytocin is the tribal drug. It's what makes you love group insiders, and it's what makes you want to attack group outsiders. And that's, again, why I think we have to have a robust theology of tribalism and saying that God gave oxytocin for the good side of things, for the self-sacrifice, for the love, for the sense of belonging. But when you live in a Genesis 3 world, you get the bad side of things where it becomes this antagonistic attacking of others chemical in your brain.
So just so I'm clear, if I found some oxytocin, people would like the way I dance, including my wife. Is that what you're telling me? Or
exactly right.
She could have the exact opposite and current reality, which is to try to get me to stop dancing as fast as possible. Is that what I'm supposed to take away from this point?
Well, Mark, there's only one way to find out.
Something that makes me think of is when you talked about a mother bonding with its baby, right? What immediately came to my mind was, what is something that a mother will fight over? Like, one of the most dangerous things is a mother protecting her baby, right? You think about like the oxytocin that you're discussing, like that. Think about like a mother bear. That's when most bear attacks happen, is when you get in between a mother bear and her cub, right? Like, so just thinking about that aggression, like it makes sense that I think as men, we can feel this way, especially. It's true of everyone, but like I just said, mothers, but for men, it feels like, okay, I need to protect my family. Like that same, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like there's that same approach, that same feeling. So it makes sense why it extends a little bit farther out to into our tribe, but in a familial sense, like I would do anything to protect my wife, and so if that happens to be aggression and that's what I feel needs to happen, then it makes sense why something that seems like it's so loving could lead to that.
Well, and along those lines, it shows why tribalism can be so dangerous, because it turns out it doesn't take much to flip on the tribal switch in the human brain. There was another researcher, Henri Tajval, who was trying to figure out, he came out of Nazi Germany, he was Jewish, and he was trying to figure out what happened there. How did all these Germans become convinced that the right thing to do was the Holocaust? And so he's trying to understand tribalism at the root of it. And so he creates this experiment, and he begins with what he kind of sees as a minimum viable product. And his goal is to add conditions over time to see at what point do adults start becoming tribal. Like, what do you need to do to flip that switch? And so his base level experiment was this. He puts all these people into a room, and he gives them a board that's full of dots. And he asks them all to estimate the amount of dots on the board. And then the researchers, they randomly assign these people, not based on what they actually selected. They just randomly assign the people into overestimator groups or underestimator group. and they divide them up. And at the end of it, they bring in people from each group and they ask them, okay, you have two choices. Everybody can get $3, or your group can get $2 and the other group can get $1. Now, the rational thing here is to take the $3. Everybody makes more money. Why wouldn't you take the $3? Over 70% of adults picked the second option. They took the $2 and the other team gets $1. Why? Because we want to win. Again, it turns out, and he was shocked by this because he thought surely when it comes to overestimating and underestimating dots, people are not going to get tribal over something that dumb. But the reality is we do. It doesn't matter if it's dots. It doesn't matter if it's sports teams. It doesn't matter whether it's a debate over whether a hot dog is a sandwich or not. Like, it really doesn't matter. Humans, we seem to become tribal over the very, very smallest things. And so to your point, it's one thing to have a dad who wants to protect his family. I mean, I had this happen last night. I was sitting in my living room and it was dark outside. And my wife said, I see a flashlight in our backyard. Mm-hmm. And so I immediately go into the kitchen. I grab my mag light. I walk out there. I flash the flashlight on the guy and I say, who are you? What are you doing? You know? And it turns out it was the kid across the street who lost a ball and was just looking for it. So it was totally fine. Yeah. You know, just to illustrate the point, that fear was the right response in the moment. But once I realized it was just the neighbor kid looking for a ball that he lost, if I stayed in that place of like tribal defensive anxiety, I could do something awful to him. And of course, I wouldn't want to do that thing to him. And so again, this highlights where when we get into this tribal mindset, sometimes we end up doing things that are really out of balance with the offense. You know, we're putting a $10 penalty on a $2 offense. And so again, I think that's why tribalism, especially political tribalism, can be so dangerous, especially inside the church, which is called to love its enemies.
Yeah, and it's such a powerful thing. Like I said, that the upside of it, the positive side of it is something God seems to have put into us, but sin has twisted it, it's marred it, it's warped it, right, and causes it to start acting in destructive ways. But kind of sensing, Patrick, kind of the spirit of what the crossing is all about, the book and the podcast kind of all dovetailing together. One of the things you talk about is, hey, we found ourselves not being, and then we wanted to be in a place where people with different views, beliefs, practices could all try to coalesce together for the common good. Here's one of the questions: if we back the train up practically pretty far from the standpoint is, okay, well, where does this start if you can't have an agreement about what the definition of common good is? Where do you begin when? Because we talk a lot about. You've probably heard Dr. Denison talk about how we now look at truth. Everybody looks at truth as being personal and subjective, and so even the ability to get to this place of a definition of common good is becoming more elusive, and then feeding right into this tribal nature that we have. So where did you guys start to struggle with that, or how have y'all worked with that?
Yeah, we have a whole chapter on this topic about the loss of truth. And it is one of I think, the unique challenges that we're facing in the present that perhaps wasn't present in tribal battles of the past. So if you go back to the election of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, and you read some of the political ads these guys put out about each other, they were awful. In fact, they make the stuff we do today look, pretty nice. They were writing terrible things about each other. But here's what they shared in common. They both believed in a capital T truth. In other words, there were some shared realities. There were some shared truths. Now, they were debating about what that truth was, but they weren't debating about the concept of truth. They weren't debating about the idea of it. And that's really the difference I think we're living in now, is that we're beginning to see people, I would say actually on both the left and the right, who are increasingly living in their own relativistic truth chambers. I think your listeners probably will be able to see that a little more clearly with people on the left. Sometimes it's harder to see with people on the right. But I would talk about things like conspiracy theories and QAnon. If you have a loved one who is invested in a conspiracy theory, there's almost no way for you to confront them, because the minute you say you disagree, you are now outside of the circle of trust. And when you get outside of that circle, there's nothing you can say to convince them because you don't understand. And the exact same thing happens on the left, where again, they have this kind of internal circle of trust. And once you get outside of it, you lose your voice. You can't speak in. And when you have these two groups of people who both are living in these highly relativistic visions of truth, my truth is the only truth, truth. No one can disconfirm me. If you try to disconfirm me, it proves that you're wrong, which is circular logic. What ends up happening is coercion. Because in the absence of persuasion, when you cannot have common ground, the only thing you have is an arm wrestling match. All you have is majority rule. And again, this is incredibly, at least for Christians, anti-Christian. In Romans 14:5, Paul says that each of them should be fully convinced in their own mind. He's saying that Christians should change people through persuasion. But persuasion is really hard when someone gets locked into one of these relativistic truth chambers. Now, again, you're asking the question, well, how do you deal with that? And unfortunately, you try to persuade people. That's often ineffective. I find that actually the best approach to dealing with someone who's locked into one of these truth chambers, these relative truth chambers, is instead to show them radical beauty, radical goodness, radical kindness, generosity, listening. If your life is such that it convinces them to give you a hearing, that's the only way you're going to break in, because the fact that you're not a part of their tribe makes you de facto wrong. There is no disconfirmation for them. So you have to have a different tack. It can't be, I'm going to argue you into the truth.
Yeah. Patrick, I love what you were saying. I was listening to another Christian commentator yesterday. He was talking about that when people get locked into these kind of echo chambers of where they think somebody is credible, and it's really become very, very, very personal from a standpoint of its families. Even going into the holiday season in a couple of months, it's like, okay, well, how are we going to handle conversations at the Thanksgiving dinner table again, right? Because maybe last year or 2 years ago, it was some kind of a really bad kind of bloodbath of relational conflict over, because one of the things, I've experienced in my relationships is that people who used to never pay attention to a lot of these things have been energized in a way that, for decades of knowing them, they were not in any way interested in all this. They might want to talk about something about sports teams. They might want to talk about the economy. They always wanted to talk about their kids, usually, but they never wanted to talk about a lot of these things. And now they're just hyper energized around it. But anyway, this commentator I was listening to yesterday said, look, when you realize that you're not going to be able to persuade by simple, logical, rational conversation and argument, if you will, his immediate response was, the first thing is, how much time are you spending with this person? Because the more time that you spend with them, the more opportunity there is to build credibility across the bridges of just simply caring and kindness, right? Is that kind of what you're talking about?
Yeah, I think so. And one thing I would add to this is there are some really easy ways to determine how locked in someone is to one of these echo chambers, because you don't just want to assume. Even if you're talking to someone who's believing in conspiracy theory, they actually still might be open to reason. And so 2 questions that I love to ask people. The first one is this: on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being not confident at all and 10 being very confident, I'm absolutely certain would be 10. How confident are you about this perspective that you have? If they give you a 9 or a 10, you are not going to be able to convince them. They are not open to disconfirmation. A second question that I like to ask people is, what kind of evidence could I give you that would convince you that your perspective is wrong? And again, if they say there's no evidence you could give me. So a great example is this was that we were doing a series on kind of the religious right. And we brought on a guy named Greg Locke. He's a pastor in Nashville who's become CNN's favorite pastor because he's just bombastic and he says awful things. But I wanted to interview him just to get his perspective. And it was a really humanizing interview. I learned a lot from him. I actually ended up liking him in some ways, even though we disagree vehemently on some things. That said, at the end, we were talking about COVID and things around that. And I asked him those questions. I said, how certain are you about your perspective on this? And he looked at me and he goes, I'm not a 10. I'm a 10 to the 20th power, bro. And so that told me there's nothing. And I said, is there any evidence I could give you that would convince you? And he goes, no, there's no evidence you could give me that would convince me. And so I knew from that point forward, this is not someone who is rational. This is not someone who is reasonable. This is a relativist. That is by definition relativism. Your truth is the ultimate truth, and there is no convincing you. And when I'm in those kinds of scenarios, I'm very quick to disengage. In fact, the best thing you can do is actually show and model the kind of behavior that you would like in return. So if they're going on a rant and they say something that actually convinces you, like, oh, you know what, that's an interesting perspective. I can hear that. If you can show them what it looks like to say, hey, that actually changed my mind. It may, sometimes if we get fearful, like if I say that I'm going to give them too much ground, you're not trying to win a debate. You're trying to win a person. So model for them the kind of behavior that you would like them to show you in return. And then, like you said, if you have relational time with them, show kindness, show generosity, show a different way of being in the world, and pray that God's Spirit would actually convict them of their relativism and of the way that they're thinking about things.
Well, and this we may be stumbling, kind of in the territory of Solomon, nothing new under the sun, and that there were a generation or two ago, maybe even further, that kind of realized these kinds of dynamics, and that's where this whole idea of, look, when you get together with people you don't see very often, just don't talk about religion and politics. That may have been where this idea came from, right?
Yeah, I'm just one of those people where there's only so much I can talk about, weather and kids' sports and what happened in the NFL before I start getting really bored. I want to have these kinds of interesting conversations. But if I'm talking to a moral relativist, to a tribalist who will only listen to people in his or her own tribe, that's not going to be a fruitful conversation. The net result will almost inevitably be relational hurt in the long term.
Yeah, and along those, I think this could be helpful to explore more for our listeners, because I think some people in their minds think of openness or open-mindedness as more relativistic. But what's fascinating about what you just said is that it's almost the opposite, where certainty becomes relativistic. Because there's an indication of, if you're so certain about something, it must be purely from something internal. And I love that question asking about evidence, because it asks, if there is something external that convinces you otherwise, would you change your mind? And if they say no, then that is relativistic. But I think exploring that, because I think that there could be this, misunderstanding of relativism that says, open-mindedness is, because there's a difference between being open-minded to the truth and being the way people use that phrase open-minded, and I just curious.
I mean, open-mindedness, I think, becomes relativistic when C.S. Lewis had this image of someone who sees through everything and ends up seeing nothing at all, right? Where you're so open-minded that you can't land. You, in other words, on that 1 to 10 confidence scale, being a 1 is not a win either on everything. Yeah. That's a different form of relativism. It's just not the form that we're dealing with. And here would be the case for saying that being a 10 on lots of things is relativistic. It comes from this. God created an objective world. I am a subject. I don't know everything. I don't have the corner on all of the truth out there. There is an objective world outside of me that God created, and God wants me to be in conversation with that world. That world has to have, in some ways, a right to correct me when my subjective perception is wrong. And when I start saying that the objective world outside of me that God created can't correct me, I've now said that my subjective truth is the ultimate truth. And again, that's the definition of relativism. And this is what you're going to see in the conspiracy theory battles. It's what you're going to see when people start fighting over the science of COVID and this and that. I mean, you see it on both sides. I'm not saying this is a one way or the other. You're just going to see it on both sides. It's this kind of, my truth is the ultimate truth. My tribe has the ultimate truth. And there is no objective reality that can disconfirm it.
Yeah, it's what we talk about is kind of saying it in a different way, right? Is that you get to that place where I'm so much into my relativism that I just think that history begins with me. All history begins with me. Mm-hmm. But in the book, Patrick, you talk about this metaphor of the elephant and the rider. Can you kind of describe the metaphor and then unpack it for us a little bit? What are you getting at there?
Yeah, so we take that metaphor, a little parable from a social psychologist named Jonathan Haidt. He wrote The Righteous Mind and The Coddling of the American Mind. 2 absolutely excellent books, if I could say so myself.
And correct me if I'm wrong, he's not a believer, right? He's not a Christian.
Right.
Yeah. But
no, he's not. He's an atheist. What's fascinating is that he wrote The Righteous Mind as a response to the new atheists, who are saying that religion only leads to culture-wide, society-wide destruction. And he said, actually, you're like totally wrong.
Richard Dawkins, Peter Singer type group, that group. Yeah.
He was rejecting their perspective and saying, no, actually, religion is really good for society. And in fact, if you take religious belief out of society, there are some moral foundations to how we think about morality that we lose in the process. Now, I don't know how he squares the circle of being an atheist and saying those things, but that's what the book is about. So I'll leave that for Jonathan. But in a different book he has called The Happiness Hypothesis, he tells a parable of a elephant rider. And this elephant rider wakes up one morning and decides, I'm going to go visit my aunt. And so he climbs on top of his elephant and he starts telling the elephant where to go. But the elephant, being the elephant, doesn't want to go anywhere at all. And then off into the distance, the elephant sees a tree with some nice fruit and starts walking towards it. Well, precisely at that exact same moment, the rider had hit the elephant and said, let's go. And so the rider thinks, see, I am in control of the elephant. I made the elephant get up and go. As the journey continues going forward, he gets to a fork in the road. If he goes right, he goes to his aunt's house where he intended to go. If he goes to the left, he goes to his mom's house. And when the elephant gets to the fork in the road, he takes the left and takes the rider to his mom's house. And when he arrives at his mom's house, his mom says, what are you doing here today? I thought you were going to go visit your aunt. And the rider responds to his mom and says, well, I was going to go visit my aunt, but when I got to the fork in the road, I decided that I wanted to see you instead. Now, the point of the parable is to say that the human heart, our desires, our loves, that's the elephant. And the human mind, the rational mind, is the rider. And the rational mind's job in many ways is to rationalize what the heart wants. The heart wants what the heart wants. I mean, Blaise Pascal talks a lot about this. And this is something that I think sometimes Christians miss because we have a tendency at times to treat the rational mind as though it's not fallen. But that's not what Jeremiah says. Jeremiah says that the heart is sick, and because the heart included both our thinking and our feeling, that it's deceitful. In other words, our minds can be deceived. And so one of the problems is that your elephant, your heart, it loves tribalism. It wants to belong in a group. It will always, given the opportunity, run towards the tribal option over the more honest option. And so you're in a tough place because that means your rational mind's job is to justify the tribalism that your heart wants. And we do this in a lot of different ways. We talk in the book about how we do it as the politician or the preacher or the litigator. The politician is someone who justifies what the heart wants by word policing other people. Like, oh, I want what I want because it's the kind thing, because it's the best thing, and it's winning people by saying, hey, this is the right thing in that sense. The preacher it rationalizes what the elephant wants morally. It says this is the correct thing to do. This is the upright thing to do. And the litigator is when the rational mind starts arguing the rational case. I want this for all of these rational reasons. And why it's important to know this about yourself, that the heart wants what the heart wants, and by the way, the heart is largely in charge, is that it tells you that the only way that you're going to leave tribalism behind is by changing your loves. Your rational mind is going to justify all different kinds of things. And I'm not saying that the rational mind has no part to play. I'm not trying to minimize it, but I'm saying more fundamentally, this was Augustine's great insight, that sin is just disordered love. It's when you love something more than you should. And that's exactly what Christians need. We have to have correctly ordered loves in our heart. And when your elephant wants and loves the right thing, your rational mind becomes this amazing tool for truth telling. But if your elephant loves the wrong things, your rational mind becomes an amazing tool for deceit.
Man. Yeah. And I had the immediate temptation, which I'm sure pretty much anyone who's listening can relate to, which is, oh, that's other people. Other people do that.
Yeah.
But, I don't do that. And then I would proceed to rationalize how I don't do that, No, but it's really good to, I think, know yourself according to those categories. It's really interesting. And I'd recommend people to read the book for that. It was those three little buckets of kinds of ways we rationalize or, cover up what our heart desires. So I guess one question at this point, I feel a little cynical about that. Like, and as we mentioned earlier, how with the holidays coming up, a lot of people in the past have ignored it or wanted to stay away from it. And maybe that's going to be true in the holidays this year because of how polarizing everything is. But considering how it seems very hopeless, especially with people who are stuck in this relativistic position or these echo chambers, we could delve into all those and take hours and hours to talk about those things. But just as far as practical steps for holidays, is it even worth talking about politics? Should we be apolitical in our churches? You talk about that in the book too. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, we in some ways are going to run against the grain of a lot of people who are talking about the same stuff. There's a fantastic book out, so I don't say this as a critique. There's a fantastic book out by Andy Stanley called Not in It to Win It, and he's saying a lot of the same things as us. One of the major differences between what Andy says and what we say is for Andy, the goal of the church is to win souls. And I don't disagree that the goal of the church is to evangelize and bring people to Jesus. That is one of our missions. However, I have a more maybe robust view of what the church is called to do, that we are called to be renewers and restorers of God's created world, and that Jesus' prayer, your kingdom come on earth as in heaven, is only actualized through Christians obeying his way and being faithful to him. One of the ways I've tried to illustrate this is by pointing out that the gospel itself is a political message. And what I mean when I say that, so back in 9 BC, so this is before Jesus is born, there was an inscription that was written celebrating Augustus Caesar, the Caesar at the time of Jesus' birth. And this inscription describes Caesar as the Son of God. It says, this is the good news, or the gospel. It's literally the Greek word for gospel. This is the gospel of the birth of Augustus Caesar, who has brought salvation to the world, who is a bringer of peace, who is Lord, who is the Son of God. So this is before Jesus was ever born. And when you realize that there was a gospel of Augustus Caesar, and now all of a sudden you have this Jewish rabbi going through ancient Israel, pronouncing a good news of a different Lord, of a different Son of God, you begin to understand why this guy was crucified. Because his message was terribly offensive to the Roman regime. And that's exactly why, by the way, early Christians were martyred, because they refused to give their heart's deepest allegiance to Caesar. They would not pledge allegiance to Caesar. Instead, they pledged their allegiance to Jesus. And so when we talk about the term gospel, we have to realize that was actually a very political term. It has a political vision. But Jesus, when I say political, people think I'm talking about partisan politics. Jesus's politic isn't about partisan politics. Look, the guy's on the throne of heaven. Getting a job in the Oval Office would be a major downgrade for him. He's got a better job. Right? Jesus's politic, what I mean when I say that is a politic is classically the way in which we organize society, how we deal with offenses, how we treat sex and sexuality, how we organize families. These are the classical kinds of questions that politics deal with. And Jesus has something to say about all of these things. And so the key for me isn't avoiding the partisan conversations, but I don't think we need to avoid the political conversation. If the political conversation entails, how do we love our enemies? How do we organize our families? How do we treat our sex lives? These kinds of fundamental questions that we need to explore. So I don't know if that fully answers your question, but that's what I like to do is generally sidestep the partisan conversation and instead talk about, hey, we're followers of Jesus. He gave us the Sermon on the Mount. He's given us our church, its kind of constitution. How do we live that out right now in our culture?
What you're driving at makes me think about how we do that, understanding that we're not the only group in the world, that we're living around a bunch of people who don't embrace the perspective, what we generally talk about as a biblical worldview or a biblical perspective. They're not looking through that lens. And so they don't see the world the way we see it. They don't see human nature the way we've been talking about it this morning on this podcast. They don't think that some of them don't even think there is such a thing as sin, and that we have, as Jeremiah said, a broken heart and a wickedly deceived heart. They're thinking, no, whatever's in my heart is good, and it's just there, and it should be what is in everybody's heart. And so we have to try to come to this idea of this politic. This, I think the word polis comes from the word city, or how are we going to occupy this planet, this house, or this neighborhood together? How are we going to do that? When some of us have very, very different understandings and views, it's just, listening to Jonathan Hyatt, it just, in your comments about him, it's like, okay, wait a minute, an atheist is canceling another atheist. It's like, how does that work, right? But that's kind of what goes on at all these different levels. But we have to have these conversations. We have to have these conversations about how we're going to do this. Otherwise, we're going to have to just all go to neutral corners, out in the wild prairie of Missouri or somewhere else, and just live in communes and hope that we don't encounter each other or bump into each other, which is simply not going to happen in any way. Right?
The Amish option. Well, and I would say this: Jesus said that the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul, and the second is like this: to love your neighbor as yourself. And politics is part of how we love our neighbor. If you love your neighbor, you should seek their good and their welfare. Our calling is to create shalom. Now, the major difference, I think, between Jesus's approach to how we do this and maybe how we're seeing a lot of the culture warriors try and do this is that Jesus trained us in the way of exile. In my view, Jesus couldn't vote in a Roman election if those were had. He wasn't a Roman citizen. He saw himself as an exile. Peter, when he writes to Roman citizens living in Turkey, he calls them exiles as well. And when you start thinking about yourself as an exile, it reframes your goal. My goal is personally not to take America back for God. My goal is to be like Daniel, to do my job with faithfulness, with excellence, such that the king sees the goodness of my work and elevates, gives you influence over time, but I'm not clawing for power. A different way of framing this would be the Lord of the Rings, the difference between Boromir and Faramir. Boromir says he wants the Ring of Power because he believes if I take the Ring of Power, then I'll do something good with it. Of course, the problem is everyone who takes the Ring of Power doesn't use it for good. Instead, they're transformed by it into a monster. And then there's Faramir, who refuses to take the Ring of Power. And his father critiques him for this. As if we had the Ring of Power, we could actually fight Mordor, and now our city is falling. And Faramir understands, I can't hold that ring. The only one who is equipped to hold the ring is the one who doesn't want it.
Yeah, so now you're down a road that I think really a lot of Christians struggle to understand, okay? Because what I think Christians are not clear about is, okay, where am I actually living? Am I living in, I'm not living in Eden. That's clear. It doesn't take very long to realize I'm not living in Eden, but I am headed to a new creation. God has promised that there is this new kingdom that is the ultimate reality that is coming. It is a calling that is in front of us, that is inviting us to this perfectly renewed place that's coming. Okay. But okay, so where am I? Am I in the theodicy of King David's ultimate time when he was at the pinnacle of his success before he goes off the rails and Israel is this, in some way, at least at the pinnacle of their theodicy success. Okay. Is that where we are? Or am I Daniel living as an exile carried into a foreign land, and I need to try to be faithful in that context? Or is the church age something more like either David's, pinnacle place, or is it more like Daniel? Which one is it? Or is it something still other than that? And we're supposed to, am I supposed to simply be Daniel, or am I supposed to help rebuild a theodicy within the context of my country? And I think there's a lot of confusion about, okay, what should be our immediate historical, theological goal, knowing that, okay, well, we're not going to get to the ultimate goal until Jesus comes back or we die to go and be with him. So what is my perspective? Or is it some of all of that?
I think it's one of the key questions that Christians are wrestling with. And you said earlier that some of us think that history began when we were born. And we have to understand that America has a long and interesting and actually very diverse history of how American Christians have oriented themselves around this question. You go all the way back to the days of John Winthrop, where he talked about God making a covenant with the New Englanders in that colony to establish a city on a hill. Now, I actually find that really problematic for several reasons. Reason number one is a lot of the verses he used were applied to Israel, and we aren't Israel. So I think we have to make a firm difference. The second thing is that where those promises to Israel are applied, they are continually applied not to a state, but to a church. So when Peter calls people exiles in 1 Peter 1:3, later on in chapter 2, he picks up the language of Exodus 19 and he calls the church a holy nation. That's what God called Israel. And so Peter is clearly saying the church is now that holy nation that God has established. Well, the church is not the state. And so that's why I have some problems with the idea of God making a special covenant with a state, because I'm saying you're taking what God gave to the church and you're trying to give it to a regime. That's a huge problem. And if you're a conservative who doesn't believe in big government, I mean, I don't understand how you can hold that together. And so for me, that's why I would argue that the metaphors that the New Testament gives us for how we orient ourselves in society are largely metaphors of exile. The church should be for the shalom of its society. The church is not called, I don't think, to be the rulers of society. There was a very famous House of Representatives person, I won't name her, who very publicly said that the church should rule the state. And I thought, well, that is a really strange take, because that does not seem to be the aspirations. And the question is, well, why wasn't that the aspirations of the New Testament church? Because Jesus already reigns. The fundamental problem is that, again, I'm Reformed, so I'll just say this. I believe in God's sovereignty, and because I believe that God is sovereign and sitting on the throne, I just don't get really bent out of shape when culture doesn't look exactly the way I think. I know how the story ends. I know who's really in charge. This time is temporary, and if I see it as a temporary time, I can live loosely to the changing mores of culture, realizing that the sovereign king, he will do with it what he wants. What he needs me to do is obey him, to love my enemies, to speak with gentleness, to do my job with excellence, to speak truth to power when the time comes, but to always do it with gentleness and respect. That's what he needs. And whatever the results are at the end of that, of me doing that, it might be me being thrown into the lion's den, or me being thrown into prison, or it might be Christians being elevated into higher political office. Whatever the results are, I don't have to worry about the results. He is still in charge. He's got it under control. I need not fear.
Yeah. So can you speak a little bit more into that not worrying? Because we've talked about this on the podcast before. How is this perspective, how does it allow us to not worry when we realize that Jesus is on the throne? And how could that potentially open us up to being more open to the truth and less grounded or less controlled by kind of tribal politics?
I think that fear is often the guiding star behind much of what is characterizing the culture war on the left and the right. I'm not saying just Christians in general. People are terrified of the idea that their vision of justice or the common good won't have supremacy in some fashion. And so everyone is out of fear clawing at getting the power so that they can instate their version of reality. And this, by the way, is one reason why I think Christians should embrace liberalism. I don't mean being a Democrat. I mean the idea of liberalism, which is that a state should be run with majority power, minority rights, that we should have free speech, a public square where all can share their ideas. One reason why I think we should be very for that is in part because we're not afraid. We know who's sitting on the throne, so we're going to be okay in the end. But the other reason is if we take power and then we use that power to enforce our vision of the good in the state, when we lose power and someone else comes in who's coming from a very different worldview and perspective, we've now created the scaffolding for them to create absolute tyranny. I don't want to live under tyranny. And again, this happens throughout history. There's a great book called How Democracies Die. And in it, they say the way democracies die, it starts at the ballot box. When people elect those who are often demagogues, who use their emergency executive powers to instate a state emergency and take power for themselves. And they often do this. Again, this is the ring. They do it in the name of the common good. I've got the ring of power. I can do it. And then what ends up happening is they shut down the press, they shut down free speech, they begin to control. It often leads to actual genocidal murder in many cases. This is the history of Russia. It's a history of China. I can go through example after example. Why in the world are Christians following the example of Stalin or Mao Zedong? I mean, that is insanity to me. I don't have to worry about ruling because I already know who rules. If I can just be faithful, we'll see what happens. God will put us there. So I don't know if I answered your question about fear exactly. I find in my own life, the less fearful I am, the less defensive I am, the more kind I am, the more I'm able to walk in the way of Jesus. That's what I want to do. I want to walk in the way of Jesus. Jesus said, don't worry about what you're going to wear. Don't worry. Maybe today say, hey, don't worry about who got into the
Yeah, and
president's
it's
office.
and it's where we all live, because I think fundamentally, when I think about our common human nature, the reality of it is after Genesis 3, we have all become control freaks, and
Mm-hmm.
we're all anxious about the uncertainty. We're uncomfortable with the mystery of life and not knowing everything. And so the way we try to address our uncertainty and the anxiety we feel over it is to try to get control. I had a leader in my church who would say, hey, I will be a benevolent dictator. If they will let me be in charge, I will be a benevolent dictator. And we all say, well, we don't want to live under a dictator unless we get to be the dictator.
Mm-hmm.
Unless we get to be the king, then we will handle the power well. We will use it rightly. We will handle it well, as you said earlier.
And you think about Jesus and the temptation from the devil. I mean, the devil literally offers him the kingdoms of the world. And Jesus, if anyone was able to say yes to that somehow and use it well, it was Jesus. He says no.
Yeah.
He rejects the offer. And so again, I'm like, man, if Jesus says no to this, maybe I'm not mature enough and wise enough to handle it myself.
And just thinking about what you said a minute ago, is Jesus in that moment saying no because he already has that position. He doesn't have to have it, and he doesn't have to receive it from the devil on his terms because it's already his anyway.
Yes.
And he's going to show him what it looks like. Okay. So Patrick, we're just about fabulous conversation. I think that will be helpful and would love to carry it on some more. But in the time that we have left, one kind of final big picture and practical question for you. You've written in the book and in other places, you talked about technology, social media. Talk just briefly. We all kind of know that this is going on, about how people will access this podcast by technology. So we can't just throw all technology in the trash can as being the big evil, right? But talk a little bit about technology, specifically about social media as a driver of this, and then some of the redemptive ways that you and Keith are trying to guide people under your care in the crossing. How do we redeem our relationship and use of social media technology, particularly?
Yeah, I'll begin just by pointing in a few different directions. There's a great piece in Compact magazine by a guy named John Askenas called Why Conservatism Has Failed. And he essentially makes the argument that conservatives are fixated on getting into arguments with progressives because they think that they've won the war for the mind. But he actually makes the case that no, technology is what's won, and technology liquidates tradition. That technology tends to eviscerate what traditional ways of life existed prior to it. And he makes the case that what Christians need to do is constantly reinvigorate, re-energize their institutions to work within the new technological realities that they're living in. And that's what I would say. What we have seen is that technology really has destroyed tradition. If you go back to 2005, when Facebook is launching, and you look at what Christians were saying at the time, they were often saying, this is a novelty for teenagers. No one's going to take this stuff seriously. It's not going anywhere. And so kind of out of nobility, we just ignored social media. Well, if you fast forward the clock another 10, 12 years later, what ended up happening? There were trolls, foreign agents that created troll farms, and these troll farms created Facebook pages targeted at Christians. An MIT technology review piece actually showed that 19 of the top 20 Christian Facebook pages, as of I think 2019 or 2020, were run by foreign troll farms. 19 of the top 20. This is over 100 million Christians who are consuming this content. Now, 9 out of the 10 things that they would post on these pages was just kind of normal Christian Bible verses, that kind of thing. But 1 out of the 10 was always conspiracy theory. It was misinformation, and it was designed to destabilize democracy. Now, the reason why they decided to go after Christians was because Christians weren't doing enough on social media. There's a real void of Christian content on Facebook. So they said, oh, here's a huge demographic that we can totally own and we can totally control. And they came in and they used it for nefarious purposes. So as I look at how social media is polarizing us, how the algorithm is incentivizing outrage. What I look at it is say, Christians, we can't disengage. We see what happens when we disengage. The enemy will fill in that gap. Instead, what we need to do is redemptively engage, or maybe even subversively engage. And so for me, this is where technology really comes into play. It's Christians taking seriously the call to understand how this technology works and then utilize it to reach people with the gospel. We do a ton of stuff at our church with technology to reach especially de-churched people. So people who haven't gone to church at all in the last few years. And we are seeing, I mean, quite literally over the last few years, well over 1,000 people who stopped going to church. They've started coming to church because of what we were doing online to reach them. Now, to me, that's a subversive, redemptive use of technology. And so that's where I would just encourage Christians in saying, yes, technology has caused a lot of social unraveling, but the answer is not to run away from it. The answer is to dive in, to understand it, and then to use it for the sake of the good. The Holy Spirit is not limited to an analog network. The Holy Spirit really can work through digital networks. It can work through, or he can work through digital technologies, just as he's done with the radio, just as he did with the printing press. There's nothing new here. We simply need to trust him and then go out in his ways and use his technology for good.
Oh, what a good word. We talk a lot about praying for and pursuing that God would bring the next great awakening. And Dr. Denison recently said, what if that next great awakening is largely a digital experience, right?
I think it'll be a lot. If you talk to, here's a great example. The church is blowing up in Iran right now. Most people don't realize that. Yep. If you go and you talk to an Iranian who's a recent disciple of Jesus and you say, hey, who's been discipling you? How have you been discipled? There's a good chance, odds are, they will say, I've been being discipled over Zoom.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's the reality is that we're from 2005, 2007, Thomas Friedman says that, cloud computing and broadband capacity is like the discovery of fire, right? It's that powerful and is going to be that prevalent. And so this is a reality that's not going away. And the social experiment that started back at 2005, 2007 is the reality. Now we have gone almost 2 decades, and the digital world is discipling at a scale and a pace unlike anything that we've ever seen. We're being discipled by it or by the people that are coming through it, right?
Yes.
And that's not necessarily all bad in the same way that the Gutenberg press wasn't bad, except to the extent that people used it to spread deception in some ways, right? Mm-hmm. But that's the reality, and how Christians do what Christians have often done, which is to use these things as they come along in the most redemptive ways, and to unleash God's goodness through them in every way that we can. Patrick, thank you so much for the conversation. The book, the podcast, and probably sounds like a whole lot more from Patrick and Keith are Truth Over Tribe and Giving Your Greatest Allegiance to the King of All Kings, Jesus, as our Savior and Lord. Patrick, thank you so much for the conversation. We hope to have you on and have a little bit more conversation down the road, all right?
Happy to come back anytime. It's been great chatting with you both.
All right. Have a great day in Missouri. And we hope that if this podcast has been useful to you, that you will use it, that you will share it, that you will rate it, and that will help other people find us as well. Thanks for being a part of the Denison Forum podcast today.